Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Kerrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinekerrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Patrick Hahn. Patrick Hahn is an author of 3 amazing books and an affiliate professor of biology at Loyola University in Maryland in the US. You can find out more about Patrick Hahn and his wonderful work at his website, which is melaponula.wordpress.com. His books include Prescription for Sorrow, Obedience Pills, and Madness and Genetic Determinism. Welcome, Patrick Hahn.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Patrick Hahn, I gave the audience the titles of your books, but I think the subtitles of your books are as important as the long titles. So for our audience benefit, will you give everyone the full titles of your books, including the subtitles?
Gladly. My first book was titled Madness and Genetic Determinism: Is Mental Illness in Our Genes? My second book was Prescription for Sorrow: Antidepressants, Suicide, and Violence. And my latest book is Obedience Pills: ADHD and the Medicalization of Childhood.
Thank you for that. Now, 2 of my 10 books are about how to heal depression without drugs, the most recent being Banish the Blues Now, available on Amazon. It's one of my 8 Amazon #1 bestsellers. So that's all about how to heal depression naturally without drugs. Now, here we're going to be talking about a pretty sensitive subject, which is the side effects of prescription psychiatric medications. And I want to start the show by saying that if you are on antidepressants or you're on any sort of brain pills, we have compassion for you. And this show is not meant to judge you or blame you or label you, but to give you some information and hopefully give you some alternatives about other ways of handling things. So Patrick Hahn, first of all, how did you come to start writing on these subjects?
Well, my background, I don't have a degree in medicine. I'm not a medical doctor. My training actually is in zoology. And I've never claimed my degree gives me any authority in these matters. But it has given me a perspective, which I think is undervalued. Our bodies, and always remember our brains are part of our bodies, are marvelous instruments. They're the product of over 500 million years of evolution. And I became increasingly disturbed by this vision of humanity as we're all supposed to think of ourselves as these fragile, disease-ridden creatures who need enormous amounts of medical care from cradle to grave to keep us alive. And the more, it was like falling down a rabbit hole. The more I looked into this, the more outraged I became. Now, my intent was not to write specifically about psychiatry, but if you want to write about over-medicalization, psychiatry gives you an endless range of an endless amount of material to write about.
Now, when I wrote Banish the Blues Now, which again is one of my 8 Amazon #1 bestsellers, at the time, I reported that 12% of US adults, meaning Americans over the age of 12 years old, were on some form of antidepressant. Do you happen to know what the latest statistics are? It may actually have increased during the pandemic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's possible. I haven't looked into that. My understanding was, yeah, about 12%, about 1 out of 8. So, but may have gone up during the pandemic. That's an excellent point.
Yes. And one of the things that we know is during the pandemic, levels of depression and anxiety increased to were about 33% of Americans, according to statistical research, reported having clinical levels of depression and anxiety. So again, we're here not to judge you, but to give you additional forms of information. And then the latest research, I understand, out of London showed that people on antidepressants actually didn't have different brain chemistry than the rest of us. Will you share with our audience a little bit about that latest research?
Yeah, well, they've, I don't think it really added anything to what we already knew, but it certainly brought this to a lot of people's attention. I remember in the early 1990s when the SSRIs, Prozac and the other SSRIs came out, we were deluged with the message that these drugs correct a chemical imbalance in the brain, just like insulin for diabetes. Now, even back then, I wondered if it wouldn't be better to raise your serotonin levels by non-drug means. But since then, I've found out there never was any basis for this chemical imbalance theory. It was a tentative hypothesis proposed and discarded back in the 1960s and resurrected in the 90s to sell us more drugs. We've spent billions of dollars on brain-based research, and they've come up empty-handed. We spent billions of dollars on genetics research, and they've come up empty-handed. These conditions called mental illness are not the products of defective brains. They are the reactions of normal brains to abnormal stress and trauma.
All right. Thank you for that information. Now, one of your books is about suicide and violence.
Yes.
Do antidepressants actually cause suicide and violence?
Antidepressants unquestionably cause a state of violent agitation and suicidality in some of the people who take them, not all. This evidence began coming in as soon as these drugs were released onto the market and continues to accumulate today. Prozac and its chemical cousins, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, belong to a class of drugs known as SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And as soon as these drugs were released onto the market, reports began pouring in from clinicians of patients driven to a state of violent agitation and suicidality by these drugs. This state appeared upon administration of the drug. It disappeared when the drug was withdrawn. It reappeared when the drug was reintroduced. That's called a challenge, de-challenge, re-challenge relationship. And it is considered proof of cause and effect. The state of violent agitation also disappeared upon administration of a drug to counter the effects of Prozac. Again, that is proof of cause and effect relationship. And the state of violent agitation was dose dependent. Again, proof of cause and effect relationship. And it's important to remember that the researchers making these reports were eminently credentialed experts working at the nation's top medical centers. These men were not anti-med, not by any stretch of the imagination. And these were experts who had seen agitation. They had seen suicidality. And they knew this was a new phenomenon, something that demanded an explanation. And since then, the evidence has continued to accumulate. In 2003, Dr. Healy published a meta-analysis of controlled trials of antidepressants. And he found the rate of suicide per patient in the treatment arm was 7 times greater than that in the placebo arm. I'm not talking about suicidal ideation. I'm not talking about suicide attempts. We're talking about dead bodies. If for some perverse reason, the drug companies wanted to market these wares as suicide enhancers, that would be considered overwhelming evidence that these drugs were effective at doing just that.
So Patrick, Hahn, I'd like to ask a clarifying question. So you said the rate of suicide is 7 times greater among people taking SSRIs. Is that correct?
And among people in the placebo arm, yes, almost 7 times greater.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's just absolutely incredible. Now, one of the things that we know, and part of why we're here at the Natural Healing Show, is to teach people what they can do naturally, how you can take your health into your own hands and do things that will actually improve your mental and physical well-being. And as we know that every drug has side effects. Mm-hmm. And some people, when you take any drug, some people get the side effects and so others don't. From your research, Patrick Hahn, what percent of people on the SSRIs actually feel suicidal and actually have violent tendencies? What does the research show?
I believe it was a couple of percent, like maybe 3%. I couldn't quote you an exact figure. So not most of them, but you multiply this by tens of millions of people taking the drugs, and you've got a real problem. And what is there on the benefit side? These drugs are virtually, in terms of their short-term benefits, they are virtually indistinguishable from placebo in short-term clinical trials. And these benefits, such as they are, can be replicated in full by any of a variety of non-drug means, like psychotherapy, exercise, bibliotherapy, without any of the toxic effects.
And I want to share for our audience, there was a study years ago at Duke University, and they had 3 groups of people. They had one group that did exercise alone, one group that did psychiatric antidepressants alone, and then one group that did antidepressants and exercise. And what the researchers found was short term, the people who did psychiatric medication had equal benefits, equal improvement as those who engaged in aerobic exercise, such as walking, running, spinning, cycling, swimming. And long-term, the people who did aerobic exercise actually had better long-term benefits and better long-term outcomes from their mental, emotional health than people who took drugs alone or exercise alone. So
wait, I think you've got that confused. It was the people who got exercise alone.
Yes.
Did better than either the ones who got the drug or
yes.
the ones who got the drug and the exercise. So the drug, it was Zoloft, canceled out the benefits of exercise.
Yes. Yeah. And Zoloft was used in that study?
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. So bottom line, exercise alone is more effective for treating depression than drugs alone or drugs in exercise.
Yes, I remember that study.
Yeah, Duke University. So I know myself, I do my best to exercise every day, whether I teach yoga, walk my dog, lift weights, ride a bike, go swimming, go for a hike, something.
Yes.
Now let's return to your very important work talking about suicide and violence, because as you know, here in the United States, there have been really a true epidemic of mass shootings. And these happen in schools, they happen in post offices. There's even a phrase, going postal, right? And going postal means you went crazy and shot a bunch of people in a post office or someplace.
Yeah.
So from your research, do you have any idea what percent of these mass shootings involved shooters that were on some form of psychiatric medication?
No, I don't. The short answer. Now, can antidepressants? I have a whole chapter on antidepressants and mass shootings in my book, but I freely admit that is the least important chapter in the book. As far as I am concerned, the case against antidepressants is overwhelming, even if we do not consider the possible link to mass shootings. Now, if you want to know if there's any evidence antidepressants cause mass shootings, depends on what kind of evidence you're looking for. Statistically speaking, mass shootings are, thankfully, a rare phenomenon. So if you're talking about statistical correlation, I'm not aware of any such evidence. So how could you know that antidepressants were involved in any given mass shooting? The only way to know would be to study the facts of the case. And the case I chose to concentrate on was the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting. James Holmes was a 27-year-old graduate student, ironically enough, studying neuroscience. And he went into the theater during the midnight showing of Batman Returns and opened fire, killed 12 people, wounded 70. This was a fellow who had no history of violence, none. The people who knew him described him as somewhat shy and introverted, but that description could apply to a lot of people in graduate school. And during his year at the University of Colorado, he had at the age of 27, he had his first serious romantic relationship. And the young woman broke it off. And no doubt, with the best intentions in the world, she advised him to seek the help of the campus counseling center. And he told the psychiatrist there he had fantasies about killing people. And she was not unduly alarmed, and perhaps there's no good reason to think she should have been. Those kinds of thoughts are not unheard of, especially among introverted young loners. So she prescribed Zoloft, and he had a bad reaction to it. He began babbling to his ex-girlfriend about his new theory that killing people would help him increase his human capital. And at first she thought he was joking, but he was serious. And he went back to the psychiatrist. He told her his homicidal ideation had increased, although he did not go into details. And she doubled the dose of Zoloft. His condition got worse. Then she tripled the initial dose. And he flunked out of school. He failed his exams. His professors offered him the chance to retake them, but he declined. And less than a month after his prescription for Zoloft ran out, he carried out his massacre. Now, while he was in jail, some doctor thought it would be a good idea to put him on another SSRI. And he had a very bad reaction to that one. And both of his parents were then put on SSRIs. Both of them had very bad reactions, which suggests some kind of genetic vulnerability to SSRIs. So we know that these drugs dull the feeling of conscience and empathy in some of the people who take them. We know they cause a state of violent agitation in some of the people who take them. And we know that in a small number of users, they cause a psychotic break. Well, what happens if you get all three in the same individual? Sounds like a recipe for mass violence. So there is no doubt in my mind antidepressants are the cause of some mass shootings like this one. As for a percentage, I couldn't give you even a rough estimate.
And this was, you're telling us about the case of James Holmes at the Aurora Theater in Colorado.
Yes.
After his psychiatrist tripled his dose of Zoloft. That's such a tragic story all the way around. Now let's go back to the average person. Why is the case against antidepressants so overwhelming in your professional opinion?
Well, they don't work. Dr. Kirsch carried out a meta-analysis. This was of Harvard Medical School in 2008. And they looked at industry-sponsored trials of antidepressants. And now, how do you know if these drugs are working? Well, they don't. In these trials, they don't measure whether these drugs made any meaningful improvement in the patient's life. All they do is check their score on a rating scale. Well, they found that the average difference on the Hamilton rating scale for depression for these drugs was 1.8 points on a 52-point rating scale. Now, for calibration, you would need a minimum of 7-point improvement for the difference even to be noticeable to a treating clinician. And this was an accusation that struck at the heart of biological psychiatry. And not surprisingly, Dr. Kirsch's detractors came at him with objection after objection after objection. They came at him with everything they had. And one by one, he slayed them all. And in 2018, there was a meta-analysis in Lancet of 522 trials of antidepressants by Andrea Cipriani of Oxford. And they concluded every one of these antidepressants outperformed placebo. And not surprisingly, the legacy media went to town on this one. It's official. Antidepressants are not snake oil or a conspiracy. They work. Pop more happy pills. Antidepressants do work, and many more people should take them. Now, that last one was from Newsweek. And that last one was particularly fatuous because the Cipriani study had no information on the harms of antidepressants and no information on the comparative effectiveness of non-drug therapies. But never mind that for now. What exactly did Dr. Cipriani and his colleagues find? They found the standardized mean difference. They used the studies employed a large number of rating scales, not just the Hamilton rating scale. But they found the standardized mean difference between antidepressants and placebo was 0.3. And that was actually a tiny bit less than the tiny difference that Dr. Kirsch and his colleagues found. And then a year later, Mark Stone of the FDA published a meta-analysis of all the trials submitted to the FDA for approval of antidepressants. And he found the difference between antidepressants and placebo. He found the exact same difference Dr. Kirsch and his colleagues found, the three significant figures, 1.80 on a 52-point rating scale. Now, is there any reason to think that these pills might perform better in actual clinical practice? Actually, the evidence suggests the reverse is true. The STAR-D trial was the largest and the longest trial of antidepressants ever carried out. Now, this was not a randomized controlled trial. This was a naturalistic study to determine best practices for prescribing antidepressants. And this was run by eminently credentialed researchers, every one of whom was pro-med. And they pulled out all the stops to give the drugs a chance to work. These patients received a clinical experience par excellence, at least compared to the hurried medication management visits that are the standard in the field. And they found that 1 out of 17 patients stayed in the trial and achieved sustained remission. 1 out of 17. That is staggeringly ineffective.
Now, with that important information, let's take a break here and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. And we'll be right back with more shocking information from author and biology professor Patrick Hahn. Hang in there, we'll be right back. So Patrick Hahn, author and affiliate professor of biology at Loyola University. We're talking here about the dangers of antidepressants. And I want to make a couple of personal comments. So 2 of my 10 books are about how to heal depression naturally without drugs. I joke with my clients, I'm not a doctor, I don't play one on TV, but I've helped more people heal depression and anxiety naturally than I can even count. My first 10 years out of 29 years in natural healing full-time was learning all about how to heal the brain. And one of the things that we know is that natural healing does work, exercise being just one of the many tools that we have here at natural healing. And the information that you're sharing is truly shocking. And someone who's listening to this broadcast who is taking antidepressants, so a very practical question is, if a person is taking antidepressants and they're feeling suicidal and or having thoughts of violence, what does that person need to do?
Wow, that's a good question. Unfortunately, person who calls the authorities may find herself sectioned and forced to take more drugs. One thing is, don't stop taking the drugs. That can be disastrous, which to me is an excellent reason not to start taking them in the first place. But that doesn't help people who are already taking them. I would recommend contacting a trusted family doctor or finding a therapist who is knowledgeable in tapering people off these drugs. And people have no idea that often when people stop taking, when either starting, stopping, or increasing the dosage, those are the dangerous times.
So the dangerous times are starting, stopping, or tapering, right?
Well, yeah, or going off abruptly. That's
right,
very
or
dangerous.
going off abruptly.
Do that.
Right. Well, one of the things that I talk to my clients about this, if you had any other medical condition, like let's say you had a thyroid problem, well, a medical doctor would actually measure your level of thyroid hormones and go, oh, Catherine, you are low in thyroid hormones and therefore you need to take some. Or if you have a cholesterol problem, the doctors measure your level of cholesterol and then they adjust the medication accordingly. However, what we find society-wide is that these antidepressants are prescribed with absolutely no medical testing at all. It's all subjective. Patrick Hahn, author of 3 books on this subject, why do doctors not test brain chemistry before prescribing psychiatric medications?
Well, there are no tests. In my books, I talk about this. By the end of the 1970s, psychiatry was facing this crisis of identity that threatened its very existence. The so-called minor tranquilizers, like Valium, had been exposed as the dangerous and highly addictive drugs they were. The major tranquilizers, like Thorazine, were derided by people forced to take them as instruments of torture. The other somatic interventions for so-called mental illness, like lobotomy and insulin coma, had become as discredited as bloodletting. And the tired old dogmas of Herr Dr. Freud seemed about as scientific as astrology or tarot reading. And the only thing psychiatry had left was talk therapy. And I'm sure a lot of psychiatrists did some good in that capacity. But there was a growing awareness among the public and among themselves that the conditions they were treating were not really diseases. And what they were doing was not really practicing medicine. And there was now a growing army of lesser paid professionals, counselors, psychologists, social workers, doing the same thing that psychiatrists were doing, not to mention a growing army of lay therapists. So psychiatry was at a crossroads. They could have, the practicing psychiatrists could have concentrated their efforts on talk therapy and accepted the salaries of a psychologist or a social worker. Medical schools could have began shuttering residency programs in psychiatry. And they could have merged the American Psychiatric Association with the other APA, the American Psychological Association. In short, they could have begun the process of dismantling psychiatry as a profession. Now, of course, they didn't do that. Instead, they embarked on this vigorous rebranding campaign. And we were told that these conditions that they called mental illness were brain diseases. I just reread John Franklin's 7-part series for the Evening Sun, which won him the Pulitzer Prize in 1984. And he was making all these extravagant promises. Within just around the corner, we would have biological tests for all these mental illnesses, and psychiatrists would have safe and effective medications for these chemical imbalances. And he went on and on that we will predict violence in people before it happens and give them the drugs to treat it. And we will have designer personalities in just 3 to 5 years. That phrase appears repeatedly in the article, 3 to 5 years. And here we are almost 40 years later. None of these promises have come true, not one. We spent billions of dollars on brain-based research, billions of dollars on genetics research. They haven't come up with one cure or treatment or even a diagnostic test for any so-called mental illness.
Now, with that, let's take another break and listen to another message here at UK Health Radio from one of our commercial sponsors, and we'll get more very disturbing information, but important information for our whole society from author and biology professor Patrick Hahn. We'll be right back. So Patrick Hahn, author of 3 books about the dangers of psychiatric medication. As you know, many people in our society have been on antidepressants for decades. Are antidepressants addictive?
That's a good question. It all depends on what you mean by addictive. So John Reed is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London. and James Davies is a reader in medical anthropology at Roehampton University. And they've studied this question extensively. And they surveyed the literature. They found that withdrawal periods, people who stopped taking antidepressants, withdrawal periods of several months or more were not uncommon. One study found the average duration of withdrawal symptoms was 90 weeks.
Wow.
And these symptoms are not benign. They include suicidality, anger, insomnia, obsessive thoughts, poor concentration and memory, depersonalization, paranoia, terrifying dreams. The list of withdrawal symptoms goes on and on and on and affects just about every major organ system of the body. Some of these complaints are literally indescribable in standard medical terminology. Head like cotton balls stuffed in, vision lagging behind eye movements, brain sloshing. And you listen, the most heartbreaking part was the personal stories of the people who tried to withdraw from antidepressants. I am unable to work, communicate, or basically function on any level that makes life worth living. I exist as a shadow of the person I once was. I cannot function to do simple tasks like make a cup of tea, let alone go to work. And a lot of these folks found themselves unable to kick the antidepressants, gave up entirely. I can only withdraw from a limited time because the symptoms are too severe to tolerate. I've tried several times to come off unsuccessfully. I don't want to be on these drugs anymore as they have too many side effects, but I can't stop. So, are antidepressants addictive? Well, one way of answering this question would be to ask the antidepressant users themselves. Dr. Reed did just that. He and his colleagues surveyed antidepressant users and found about half of them considered themselves addictive. Half of those considered themselves to be severely addicted, the most extreme rating category that was offered. Or we could just look the word up in the dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary defines addiction as the compulsion to take a drug, the stopping of which produces withdrawal effects.
Now, during my 29 years full-time experience in natural healing, I have worked with countless clients while they are getting off antidepressants. And I always talk to the clients about several caveats. I'm repeating myself. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV. You need to do this with the knowledge and consent of your medical doctor. That's just prudent, right? And also I say to my clients, this is not about being noble or not noble. This is about being healthy. So it's my experience, again, from 29 years full-time experience in natural healing, and the author of 2 books about how to get off drugs naturally, that if you do want to withdraw, don't just throw them in the toilet. You actually need to embark on a journey of personal healing. And this could include, what this looks like could include using amino acids to help balance your brain chemistry. Your neurotransmitters, your brain chemicals are all made from amino acids. I just spoke yesterday to a client who's been a lifelong vegetarian, who's had chronic depression and anxiety that hasn't been cured. And we talked about testing your amino acid levels. This could involve enjoying a regular exercise program. It could involve taking advantage of natural healing therapies such as craniosacral therapy, which balances your brain naturally, and using flower essences to balance the emotional aspects, and doing trauma therapy to release the trauma that caused the depression and the anxiety in the first place. And I've done a number of radio shows here at the Natural Healing Show about how to heal depression without drugs. So there's a lot of information about this, and you can read or listen to my 2 books on this subject. Now, one of the things that I've worked with over the years is pregnant women who are on antidepressants. What does the research show, Patrick Hahn? Do antidepressants cause birth defects?
Yes. These drugs cross the placenta, they cross the blood-brain barrier. We know these drugs alter the levels of serotonin, which is an evolutionarily ancient signaling molecule that predates the origin of animal life itself, and which is involved in the development of the brain, the heart, the lungs, probably every organ in the body. None of these drugs have been tested for safety and effectiveness in pregnant women. None of them. And we know that these drugs cause truly horrendous birth defects in a small number of people who take them, not all. About 2.7% of babies born to women taking Prozac have primary pulmonary hypertension, which can be fatal. There's a mountain of studies that show that Paxil causes truly horrendous heart defects like transposition of the major arteries. 5 years ago, GlaxoSmithKline paid out $6 million to Canadian women who'd given birth to babies with birth defects while taking Paxil, after taking Paxil while pregnant. And of course, we know $6 million is chump change to a company like GlaxoSmithKline. And all these disturbing findings are even more disturbing when you realize that 1 out of 6 American women of childbearing age are taking these drugs.
Mm.
And half of all pregnancies are unplanned. And we know that we've already seen trying to go off these drugs can cause truly excruciating withdrawal effects. I was just talking to Linda Wastila. She's a professor of pharmaceutical health services research at the University of Maryland. And she raised a point I hadn't thought of, because we know these drugs alter the levels of serotonin. Going off them, no doubt, alters the levels of serotonin. Does that cause birth defects? We don't know. Nobody studied it. But yeah, when you think of all the other problems with the drugs, and you know that the women who are prescribed these drugs, they're not apprised of these hazards, not at all.
No. And, you mentioned serotonin. Well, one of the things that we know is that over 90% of your serotonin is produced in your GI tract. Mm-hmm. So improving your diet, healing your gut, these are all known ways to naturally increase your body's natural production of serotonin. Now, Patrick Hahn, did the FDA black box warning increase suicides? And also for our audience, what was the FDA black box warning about antidepressants?
Yeah, that's a good question. The facts are these. In October of 2004, the FDA required all SSRIs to come with a black box warning stating that these drugs cause suicidality in adolescents. 2 years later, this warning was extended to youth up to the age of 25. Now, they never explained why this effect magically turns itself off after the 25th birthday, but never mind that for now. In 2007, there was a paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry by Robert Gibbons of the University of Illinois, Chicago, that claimed that youth suicide rates rose after the black box warning was issued. And again, the media went to town on this one. Youth suicides increased as antidepressant use fell. As youth suicide increased, FDA's labels rules criticized. Warning may be killing kids. And there was just one little problem. When Dr. Gibbons and his colleagues compared data on antidepressants and youth suicide rates, they didn't look at the same years. Now, when I first read this in the Mad in America website, I thought, no, that can't possibly be true. There is no way an error like that could have survived the process of peer review. Oh, yes, it did. Dr. Gibbons and his colleagues looked at figures for antidepressant prescriptions for 2004 and 2005, but they only looked at suicide rates for the year 2004. And as I mentioned, the warning came out in October of 2004, almost the end of the year. So what happened in 2005, the first full year after the black box warning was issued? The Gibbons paper doesn't say, but it's easy enough to find out. In 2005, youth suicide rates dropped. They dropped again in 2006. They dropped again in 2007. Now that's exactly what we would expect to find if the black box warning had its intended effect.
Now let's bring this back to a practical point for our audience. Now, if I remember the statistics correctly, suicide, I believe, is the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 30. Is that correct? Am I right about that?
Yeah, I believe that's correct, yeah.
Which is shocking. Suicide is the leading cause of death for our young people under the age of 30. In your professional opinion, as the author of these 3 books, if a parent has a child who's having problems, is it safe to give a young person antidepressants?
It is not safe. There have been 45 trials of antidepressants in children. Of these, 45 were negative. That is the greatest concentration of negative trials for any drug indication on the planet. And yet they still prescribe these drugs to kids. How can they get away with this?
So, and by negative trials, will you explain for our audience what you mean by that?
Meaning there was no clinical benefit to antidepressants.
So there's, from your research, and how many studies again was this? 45?
45.
So there are 45 studies done, and there's no clinical benefit for antidepressants for what age group?
I don't know these. I believe under 18. I'm not sure exactly, but yeah, under 18, I believe.
Well, one of the things that we know for a fact is that before you're 25, your brain is still developing.
Yes.
Right? And so when we take antidepressants, as our brain is developing, that can affect our brain development,
Yes, indeed.
which can affect our whole lives. So Patrick Hahn, as a society, where do we go from here?
Well, I have some thoughts on the matter, which I'm willing to offer for your consideration. You know, since time immemorial, nations vanquished other nations and built empires. And the ones that were not good at it got stomped on by the ones that were. You either grew or you died. That was a moral imperative. Well, it just seems to me that this process has been completed. Little kids in mud huts in African villages are now online. I've seen this. There's no more spots on the map marked, "Here be tigers." And the only terrain left for would-be tyrants to conquer is our own bodies. And we live in an era in which most of our manual labor and increasing amounts of our mental labor are done by machines. And many of us have more value to our rulers as consumers of medical interventions than we do as soldiers or workers. And power no longer comes from land tenure. It doesn't even come from owning a factory. Power comes from manipulating the language of science and the appearance of science to control people. Our rulers no longer talk about breeding master races or establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat. They speak in much more dulcet tones. That's a very good sign. That means they're afraid of us. And nowhere is this fear on display more rawly than in the muling of the legacy media. You must not do your own research when it comes to science, which is the 21st century equivalent of pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And the COVID crisis may have brought things to a head. People are fed up and they're waking up. And we have the opportunity to seize the reins of power and make society over, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, and build institutions and paradigms that operate on a human scale, do a better job of meeting actual human needs. I think it's a kind of great reset we could all get behind.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Kerrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. And one of my 10 books is called Banish the Blues Now. And that's all about how to heal depression naturally without drugs. We have been listening to important information from author and affiliate professor of biology, Patrick Hahn of Loyola University. His books include Prescription for Sorrow, Obedience Pills, and Madness and Genetic Determinism. You can find out more about Patrick Hahn and his important work at his website, Meliponula, that's MELIPONULA.wordpress.com. And remember, natural healing actually works to heal depression. And when you take advantage of natural healing, you're not going to suffer the side effects that we've been talking about today. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.